The spiritual for me has always been really, really, really important. And I want my work to uplift you. Flat, simple statement. I want you to look at my work and feel better about your situation, about your life. My name is Robert Kushner. I work and live in New York City, but I was born and raised in the beautiful suburbs of Los Angeles, which were beautiful in the 1950s when I was growing up. And my mother was an abstract expressionist painter. She and her women friends were extremely involved with gesture and authenticity and not being graceful and pretty. They were tough. They were strong. They were great. So that's how I grew up. My mother was a modernist in every way, including music. So when I was growing up, we didn't have a regular stereo. She still had a Victorian wind-up thing with the horn, and that was my record player. But she had a set of 78s of Stravinsky Firebird. I thought that was the most exciting music I'd ever heard, and I'd put it on in her studio and I'd run around in circles and I would throw things in the air. I must have been just the weirdest kid ever, but she thought it was wonderful. Second grade, we were supposed to bring in our favorite piece of music, so I brought in Firebird. And some of it's very fast and bright, and some of it's very slow like this. So I put it on, and unfortunately I put it on one of the slow sections, and the teacher is looking at me because the record player's going, Stravinsky, and the students are looking at me, and I was humiliated because the next person said, well, my favorite record is Sylvester and Tweety Pie. And there was this little cartoon where they were doing this, and I thought, uh-oh, I'm weirder than I thought. I always thought I was strange, but it was devastating. And then I spent a long time trying to be normal. I mean, I'm not abnormal, but just in my taste. And then I gave up. Somewhere in college, I just said, okay, this is the way high school, really. I didn't talk to men when I was growing up. There was my mother, and she gardened, and then there was the lady next door, and she was a really serious gardener, and then the lady on the other side. So this is what I grew up with, was just, oh, you put things in the ground, and it grows. And in LA, it's very easy to garden, because it never freezes. So they don't talk back. The plants don't say, I hate Stravinsky. And I found that I could make friends that way, because I remember walking home from school and there's this man who always kept a cactus garden, and I would stop and talk to him, and I'd say, can you give me a piece of that? Because you could just cut it off and put it in the ground. And then there were some famous gardens near us, the Huntington Library and the Huntington Library Garden. We went to if there was company, if we had guests. And the cactus garden there is spectacular, because it's an English garden but done with cacti. So there'll be just little hills of cacti. And I thought, I want to do that. And I love the plants, and I still do. I mean, when I started painting flowers almost exclusively, it was easy because those were the things I had observed as a child. So I just thought, well, this is what I can do. So I had a cactus garden. I had a collection of geraniums. There are many varieties. My grandfather liked roses, so each year he lived with us. He would buy rose bushes and I'd plant them. And I'm feeling compassionate to that person, because it's a little the same as me and a little different. But I needed something to show off. I needed something that was really mine. And that's how it worked. so many memories of making art with my mother. I had my own art supplies. I couldn't touch hers. That was forbidden. I literally couldn't touch them. But I had my own. And they gave me a little room in another barn that was my studio. So all my life I was making art, and I was getting good feedback, particularly from my mother on the art I was doing, because she'd been an educator as well. And my mother was fine. She said, okay, you should do the art, and if it doesn't work out, you'll do something else. That was her attitude. And my dad was very worried. And somewhere I have a letter from one of my uncles saying, you're making a waste of your life, you have a good mind, why are you going to do that? But I did. And I don't regret it for a minute, because, I learned how to think from my professors, and particularly some of the art professors. One of the art history professors, brilliant man, gave 3 lectures on how you could not prove that Cézanne knew what he was doing. So time, because Cézanne at that time still is like God. By the end of that semester, the only artists that he had not been able to tear down were Mondrian, Duchamp, Schwitters. Interesting. Cézanne, not perfect? How could that be? And so it got me to think. And at the time, it was supposed to be ultra conceptual. So I started making costumes so that they existed only in time, so that they existed as a performance on a body, on a naked body, on my naked body, which was very provocative and very much in keeping with the 60s. Today, it would be much more aggressive to say, here I am naked. And there was just like, everybody was taking their clothes off. So I learned how to justify things. I learned how to clarify things. And I could still make things. So I would sit there crocheting, and we were also supposed to analyze things that were magical from our childhood that were not in the canon of art making. So I had spent a lot of time crocheting with my grandmother. My father was a furrier at that time, making fur coats, and he would save the little paws of the minks, and I had a little box of mink feet. How weird is that? I mean, you can tell why I didn't have a lot of friends. So when you would come look at my mink feet, they would just go running for anywhere else. So I just thought of all those things that added up to my idiosyncrasy and put it into the art. And I just thought, wow, it was freeing. And I got good feedback, because somehow that combination of the costumes and the objects and everything added up, and people said, oh, this is good, you're good. So I got out of college. I moved to New York in 1972. 1974, my professor, Amy Golden, who was my mentor, wanted to tour Turkey, Iran, and Afghanistan. She had been studying Islamic art history at Harvard University, and she knew exactly where she wanted to go, but also knew she didn't want to go as a single woman. So we were not a couple at all, but she was my mentor, but she said, if you'll pay your way, I have the itinerary. That was my first time out of America. I still remember getting out of the plane, and I had flown in America, but in Istanbul, and it wasn't America. So on that trip, I had already started collecting textiles. So she and I would go into the bazaar, particularly in Iran, and we would buy things, and then about every 2 or 3 weeks, fabrics, we would send them back in a box. And when we opened the boxes at the end of the trip, a lot of them had holes or rips, which we hadn't even noticed. So I just made up how to restore them. sold the things that I had bought at a substantial markup, which paid for the trip. We can't do that today, but you could then. So I apprenticed to a restorer, and I had friends who had a very high-end textile business where it was very sophisticated what they were doing, and they knew that I could restore 18th century key limbs, which are rare, and I had a good eye for color. So for about 4 or 5 years I did that. They would give me something that was, to me, spectacular, that I couldn't afford to buy, but I could live with it for 2 weeks while I was restoring it. And it was a perfect job, and it allowed me to really literally enter into the warp and the weft of what I was doing, because there'd be this little hole and I would replace the vertical threads, and then for the horizontal I would count, okay, I have to go 3 warp threads over and then turn around, and then I'll change to blue, and then I have to change to cream, and then it was a way to really learn how those textiles had been made. And it allowed me to feel like I wasn't a fake. Because I remember feeling like, I want everybody to see how fantastic these decorative traditions are, that I didn't know anything about with my formal art history. I mean, it was Europe, America, maybe East Asia, period. Nothing else, nothing tribal. And yet, the things I was looking at that moved me more than going to another museum show of a minimal sculptor. Good God, how much of that can you take if you've got my temperament? I wanted everyone to say, wait a minute, those key limbs are as good as anything else. Those Suzanese, the embroidered Uzbek things, are transcendent. And someone spent a year making that. But we put it down here because, number 1, they were anonymous, number 2, they were women, and number 3, they were Uzbek. I mean, not, you know, if we have 0 to 100, it wasn't even on the chart for 0. If I looked hard at a key limb and found the relationships, and I would try to actually think about the psychology of the weaver. And when I was 20, I bought one key limb that I still own. And I hang it up maybe every 3 or 4 years. And I just put it up this winter. And I looked at it and I just said, oh, I forgot how great this is. I mean, it was just like, I was almost quivering. And I remember feeling like I think one person started it and someone else finished it. Because if you looked at the color relationships here, it was red, blue, black. And by the time you got over here, maroon, light blue, yellow, it was a different head. So either this person, maybe they started out with those colors and ran out of them. Maybe they started with those colors and someone gave them the dyes for the others. Something happened between this side and this side that I could only understand by looking and looking and looking and thinking. The relationship between these textile sources and architectural sources for me. And fine art was, did it give me something to really chew on? Could I really think about it? Could I really think about the relationship between that branch of flowers and that stem of flowers in the 18th century textile? And was it as interesting as what I was looking at in the museums? Now I have my collection of artists whom I treasure. I saw here in Paris the Matisse show, in Matisse 1930's, which was not his best decade, I'm sorry to say. But there were about 5 paintings in there that just made me stop. It just stopped me because I said, what are you trying to tell me? Uncle Henri, what are you trying to tell me? I am your devotee, I am your servant. And then I get that same feeling when I'm looking at Odilon Redon or any Bonnard painting. He is so subtle, because there's something in a Bonnard that is not obvious at the beginning. And there are women too, like Georgia O'Keeffe, Florine Stettheimer, an American painter who I adore. I adore her work, that are just as interesting as these textiles. That's saying a lot, because I put these anonymous textile artists on a very high level. So for a Western artist to sustain my interest that way is a big hurdle to jump over. But I'm grateful that I can do what I do. I am extremely grateful that people buy these things. But at this point, the work in this exhibition is almost like a historical fact. It existed so long ago, and I'm still doing it. I didn't just stop. So the last show you saw, Flowers on Canvas, it looks rather different. There are no figures. It's not the unstretched canvas. The color combinations are a lot more subtle, if I may. There's no combination of sewn fabrics. But I think the aesthetic is the same, that I want it to be full, I want it to be rich, I want it to engage you in a seductive way. I want to pull you into my, whatever the weirdness up here was when I was in second grade is still there. Whereas I want the scent. It's like a rare box, and you open the box and there's a smell that you remember, but you don't remember what it was. That's where I want to take you. I want my work to uplift you. Flat, simple statement. I want you to look at my work and feel better about your situation, about your life, not worse. And I have a tremendous allergy to artists who really want to emphasize how they uniquely have suffered more than I have. This is a very, very popular stance in America. If I'm suffering, and I do, I don't want to put that in my work. I don't mind my work being sad. I don't mind my work making you feel my sadness, but I don't want you to have to empathize with my despair. And that's a spiritual position. This exhibition is a body of work that came at a very particular moment in time, where I had been painting the figure, copying photographs, and then working from models, and then drawing, pushing myself to draw as well as I could. So this occurred at a moment where I was working very consistently with models who were friends. And I was also trying to incorporate mythology, because there's a sort of famous, not famous, there's an obscure quote from about Motifs where someone said, "What are those women doing? What are they doing? They're just lying there." And there is something a little icky about that in terms of the male gaze, in terms of how come they don't have to have a job? I mean, maybe they would be thinking about philosophical treatises or maybe they are. So I thought, well, I don't want to just do more paintings of people sitting there. So I started creating these mythological contexts. And then this also coincides with my obsession with Japanese fabrics. So almost all the fabrics that are collaged here are from Japan. So there was a very specific moment in time, and then right after this, I just said, I think I've done enough figures, and I wanted to start painting on canvas, because I had never painted on canvas, being the good avant-garde student I was. And that's when I started just working only with flowers, because I thought it's easier. I'm tired of asking myself, what are these figures doing? So this is a summation rather than a beginning. It's like everything I knew how to do